interest in the psychedelic experience and its relationship to sort of the Western model of reality, scientific reality, and also psychotherapy. And so I guess the only thing I want to say is that I hope you include some of these incredible ideas that you apparently put out last night that I missed since I didn't hear the lecture, so that I won't feel I missed something.
We have a tape.
You can get the tape.
They'll send you a tape. But I imagine some of this stuff will come around.
My name is Stephanie, and I have a great amount of respect for psychoactives and their use as in traditional kind of paths of knowledge, and have used them for a number of decades in that form. I'm also interested in them for recreation. And I'm also, one of the other main reasons I'm here is because my son has expressed interest in working at the garden with you next year, and so I kind of want to know who you are.
Okay, so you're scouting.
I'm doing my motherly duties.
What kind of a maniac is this guy?
My name is Ted, and I took a certain amount of these substances in the 60s, and then after a 20-year lapse, I've taken some recently, psilocybin. And I guess my interest is twofold. One is a kind of a practical level questions like, why does physical weakness follow taking these substances? And are there any other substances that we can take before or during or after to prevent this? And ways of using the substances to gain specific kinds of knowledge, dealing with death, and then the integration of the experience into daily life, which would be your effortless, appropriate activity. And then also issues, social issues, like you last night you talked about. It takes with yoga and these others, all this takes all this time and discipline to get there. Whereas you can have it like this, but if you don't have the discipline, how do people take these experiences back into daily life without insanity? And then finally, the issue of how do you deal with the narcissism and ego inflation that can follow the psychedelic experience in certain people, along with the complete rejection of rational thought that sometimes occurs.
Yeah, that's a real problem. I know that one from the inside. Okay, now the people who slipped in while this process was raging. Sir.
Hi, my name is John Harrison. I first heard you speak on tape about 3 years ago. A mutual friend of mine, Bob Fortes, played it for me. And then I had an opportunity to hear you speak at Santa Rosa, a transpersonal conference. And what was significant for me was that you seemed to, I'm sure you've heard this many times before, but you seemed to articulate a voice that for me has been inside, that I want to express, that seems to tie together so many different aspects of consciousness, from shamanology to anthropology to pharmacology. And what's important to me is that at least for me, I want to learn how to articulate this voice so that the trivialization of psychoactives begins to cease in this society, because I believe that, as you said last night, these morphogenetic amplifiers, I love that expression, are very important in terms of our evolution. And I'm really disturbed by the environment, the political environment, which says no to these tools, these potential tools for growth. And so one of the reasons I'm here, one of the main reasons, is I'd like to learn some of the ways to tie all this together so that I can be more an agent for change myself.
Good.
My name is Kamran, and I'm interested to understand myself through using different techniques in religions and moment in shamanism. And I like to learn more about plants and their use and their power to understand myself mainly. And also I'm interested to see if there are other uses in Banisiri Kapi plants than just making the wine, and perhaps if we can combine that with effects from mushrooms or cannabis.
So going further with that plant complex.
Right.
Okay. Now, did we miss anybody? Well, I'll say just a little bit about my own interest in all this, or how I got into it. I don't know. I mean, one creates a false history when you look back into time to try and explain how you got to where you are, or at least I do. Trying now to understand how I came to be involved in the psychedelic experience, it seems to me that what it really requires is a love of the peculiar, of the weird, the bizarre, the outre, the freaky and unimaginable. And I'm not, I don't give great credence to astrology, but I am a double Scorpio, so I'm told that this kind of thing predisposes one for 12th house activity. Several times in my life I've gone through these kinds of revelations where everything seemed to change so profoundly that I could hardly recognize who I had been before. And I noticed this around the time I was 7 or 8, happening the first time. Nature and the imagination seem to be the precursors to involvement in the psychedelic experience. So I was a rock hound, a butterfly collector, a rocket builder, a connoisseur of explosives, and all of this sort of thing, while my peers were off playing Little League baseball, I was back in the hills digging out trilobites and tracking down moths and stuff like that. And then science fiction was a tremendous stimulus to my imagination, because it seemed to say, you know, anything you can imagine is fair game. Anything that you can conceive of can be treated as a reality. And but I was also very, you know, I was raised in a Catholic household, so my whole thing was to build cynical resistance to the spirit. So I was an atheist, a Marxist, an existentialist, rational, material, you know, a pain in the neck, basically. And in all of that, somehow I began reading Aldous Huxley, the social novels, Antic Hay, Chrome Yellow, these comedies of manners of British academic society. I was like 12 or something, but I always drove myself to read really beyond my level. Well, this led me to The Doors of Perception, which I had read Brave New World. Brave New World is an anti-drug dystopia, you know, a nightmarish world of plastic, never-grow-old people who take tranquilizers every time there's a hint of any deep emotion or any kind of anxiety. They just, you know, the motto was a gram is better than a dam. And you can just, for a quarter, anywhere, get one of these pills that just puts you right back into being happy and cooperative. And so Huxley, who was, you know, a very concerned person, very interested in the fate of 20th century society, went from this dystopic vision of drugs to The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell, in which he describes experiments with mescaline that essentially totally turned him around and convinced him that these medieval mystics that he was so fond of, Meister Eckhart and San Juan de la Cruz and so forth, were actually describing the same reality that he was, and William Blake, that he was getting into. So I wanted to pursue this, and this was like 1962 or something, and I was about 14 years old. And then a few months later, there were stories in the newspaper that morning glories were being abused for their psychedelic effect. Well, there was a bindweed that grew locally where I lived, so I went tearing out and gathered half a peanut butter jar of this wild morning glory, and took it home and ground it up and took it. And of course, nothing happened. But the hour before it before it failed to come on, I sat quietly and fearfully and examined my mind from that point of view for the first time in my life. In other words, examined my mind from the point of view of watching it to see if it was changing in some unpredictable way. And actually, though the morning glories were totally inactive, in that hour of watching, I did observe some interesting false positives that would come and go for a few minutes. And then a few months later, I got my data a little more together and learned that it was a certain species of morning glory, and that you had to buy the seeds from a seed company. And then I discovered what it was, not the full-blown psychedelic experience, but by this time I was in Southern California going to school, and a friend of mine and I would go out into the Mojave Desert and grind up low doses of these morning glory seeds, because we didn't know what a dose was, really, or what actually was supposed to happen, because if you read Huxley, it's pretty high-flown language. It's all about radiance and significance and existential validity flooding into the rose. Well, once you're looking at a rose and posing the question, is existential validity flooding into it? You don't have anything to measure it about. But we would go out into the Mojave and take these morning glory seeds and observe shifts in the apparent significance of things. Everything would appear somehow more pregnant with potential meaning. And then, in fact, if you would close your eyes in that situation, there would be the beginnings of hypnagogia and, drifting lights and undulating colored patterns and grids and laceworks and all these things which are the precondition for the psychedelic experience. Well, it wasn't long after that I went to Berkeley in the fall of 1965, and LSD was available. A few months later, DMT was available, and I was just stunned and have never lost that sense of profound astonishment that such things could exist. Just that they could exist. I mean, DMT seems to argue, convincingly I might add, that the world is made entirely of something that, for want of a better word, we would have to call magic. That, things are not what they appear, not at all what they appear, and that what we call reality is just some kind of utterly provisional construct that, if leaned upon too hard, can just fly to pieces before your startled eyes. Well, then the question is, what are the implications of this? What lies behind it? So forth and so on. So I, as most people do, or would, I think, looked to tradition for some kind of guidance about what this was, and read Jung, and read Mircea Eliade, and saw, parallels, but not a clear congruency, and saw in the iconography of Tibetan Buddhism seemed to me to bear certain kinds of parallels to the hallucinations that I had by that time glimpsed in LSD states. And so studied the Tibetan language, went to Asia, learned that the iconography of Tibetan Buddhism is a rip from the pre-Buddhist shamanism of Tibet, which has been there since the Stone Age. Buddhism only entered Tibet in the 7th century with Padmasambhava, and all the iconography was taken from the autochthonous indigenous shamanism that was there. But I didn't find in these yogins and lamas and geshes what I was looking for, which was direct experience of these realities. I mean, Tibetan Mahayana seemed tremendously sophisticated in its analysis of states of mind, but operationally it was not coming anywhere close to what these psychedelics were able to deliver. Well, because I was fortunate enough to have wise and well-read friends, I knew that this tradition was alive in the Amazon. And so when I finished in Asia, and I went from Nepal to India, throughout Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, ostensibly making my living as a professional butterfly collector, but also using that as an excuse to go to these extremely rural and tribal situations and observe what was going on. And I concluded that it was far in the past or far removed, that it was something that had retreated to the status of a myth in most cultures. And then, in late 1970, I went to the Amazon, and very quickly, through using mushrooms, through using ayahuasca, learned that there it is accessed, and the traditions are alive, and the attitudes were simpatico with my own, that there were not lineages. You didn't have to pledge eternal fealty to some character, that they were exploratory in their approach. They were open-minded. Everybody admitted that nobody knew what was going on with it, that yes, they could cure, yes, they could balance their societies and act as paradigms of behavior to other members of their tribe. But what they really liked to do, these shamans, was get together and puzzle over what the hell it is and how can it be, I mean, they were like scientists. They were like explorers. They didn't have a myth that encompassed it. They were technicians of myth, which they presented back to their societies. And this is something that it's very important to realize about shamanism as it is being packaged and sold in this society, that a shaman is primarily a theatrical entertainer, but they're not putting on the show for themselves. But in this society, people actually become actors on their own stage. The shamans do not believe, I maintain from spending time with them, shamans do not believe in the powers of magic words, crystals, healing darts, and so forth and so on. They manipulate these things the way a stage magician manipulates rabbits, hats, saws, and boxes with women inside them. They understand what it's for and how it works, and these things are manipulated to create an effect on other people. But the shamans understand that the real magic is the magic of sign, symbol, and language, and that by manipulating cueing, by manipulating expectation, you can lead people to a fundamental confrontation, not only with themselves, but with the other. And as I said last night in my talk, it is no easier for an Amazonian Indian to come to terms with these things than it is for a native of Manhattan. Ultimately, this coming to confront the other is coming to confront the mystery of being, not as a phrase, mystery of being. I mean, we all give lip service to that, the mystery of being. It's everywhere. It's in the trees, the stones, the elevators, the life of the city, the life of the country. Everything is radiant with the mystery of being. This is some kind of gloss. What I'm talking about is actually the mystery of being as existential fact, that there is something that haunts this world that can take apart and reduce every single one of us to a mixture of terror and ecstasy, fear and trembling. It is not an idea. That's the primary thing to bear in mind. It is an experience. And as we went around this morning, a surprising number of people spoke to it as an experience. And I think this is what makes the great distinction between the shamanic, pragmatic approach and what I called last night the political ideologue approach. That we are not working here from theory, where our theories are the weakest part of what we say. What we're working from is the fact of an experience which we need to make sense of. Now, most of these other-oriented experiences, which are hard to keep track of or make sense of, cannot be commanded freely. They're more in the realm of, you're traveling in a foreign country and you contract a terrific fever and you fall into a vision and you have deep awareness and realization about the nature of life. This is not an experience that can ever be repeated. Or you're alone in a wilderness and you confront a flying object in the sky which seems to trigger strange bursts of thought in yourself. This cannot be repeated and triggered on command. So only in the context of the psychedelic experience and the willed decision to act can you enter this arena of repeatedly going to meet the experience of the other. And it is a very, very bizarre enterprise. It is not that if we do it enough times, we will understand it or become comfortable with it, because it is not in its nature to be understood, and it is not in its nature to accommodate itself to us. Rather, it's that we've discovered another dimension, almost in the same way that Europeans discovered another world only 500 years ago. In 1992, we will celebrate the 500th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. Now, notice that when Columbus set out from Spain, there was a large body of intelligent opinion which believed that he was sailing over the edge of the world, literally, that he was sailing out of mind. And instead, what lay at the end of that voyage was real estate. Immense amounts of real estate. And we have come to terms with that, and in fact now inhabit what 500 years ago was not even on the maps. It was in the unconscious. Now it is the center of the global economy. in the same way that these European navigators began to have this intimation that the world was a wraparound. That's what it means to say that the world is round. It means you can get back to where you started from by going away continuously. In the same way that the European navigators discovered that the world was a wraparound, I think we are on the brink of discovering that you can start in three-dimensional space and time, move off in a linguistic vehicle, and find your way back to the place you left from. This means that what we call three-dimensional space and what we call the imagination actually have a contiguous and continuous transformation from one into the other. And this is big news. This entirely goes against our Cartesian expectation that thoughts inside, world outside, objects outside, perceptions inside. And this is actually nothing more, this inside-outside thing, than an artifact of European languages. And yet, we take it to be, how God made the world, basically, because we are so embedded in our language that we cannot cognize reality without it. We cannot cognize reality without our language. But then in the psychedelic state, somehow this happens. Somehow syntax is replaced by hypersyntax. Linguistically moderated and modulated perception is replaced by perception in the raw, not coded and sculpted and sifted for culturally validated meaning, but rather just the full hit. Well, this is tremendously disorienting, but it's also tremendously liberating, because that's the full deck. That's when you have full command of the options available within the matrix. If you play the cultural game, it's like playing only with clubs or something, or playing only with the red marked cards. You have to play with a full deck, and that includes this pre-linguistic surround in which we are embedded. Now, why is it so emotionally charged for us? In other words, why can the shamans go into this dimension and heal or divine, see into the future, or in a sense see into the past by discovering who stole whose cow or who's sleeping with who, or all these things that shamans are concerned with? What is this ground of being that we discover by dissolving the cultural machinery of cognition? Well, I think what it is simply reality unpackaged for a historical epoch. In other words, reality uncompromised by the need to be culturally efficacious and useful. And this is precisely what we need to throw light on our culture crisis, because the models that we have used to sanction information that is culturally useful have given us information which is toxic. I mean, we have actually created a toxic relationship between ourselves and nature. We have pursued avenues of questioning, the feedback from which have given us an overpopulated, polluted, ideology-obsessed, unresponsive planet.